10 things need to be noted when looking at slavery in the Bible. 1. The Old Testament texts are historical documents. When studying history, we must remember that the passage of time creates chasms between cultures and societies. Every feature of the past must be interpreted in its own historical context. The experience of a black slave in the Confederate States was not the experience of a slave in ancient Israel. We can't assume that Israel would have tolerated the slavery of the American Old South, or that the slave states would have found the slavery of the ancient Israelites profitable or useful. 2. The slavery described by the Old Testament texts was different in purpose, function and practice than the slavery of the British Empire or the American colonies. Ancient Israel was an agricultural community, in which every family was one bad harvest away from starvation. Money was rarely exchanged, there was no welfare system. The slavery described by the Old Testament law existed, so that workers could provide for their families in lean times. If a crop failed, a father could go to work for a landowner in exchange for a loan. Or he might send his wife or children to work in another's fields for food and board. 3. A person could also become a slave to pay a debt. There was no shame attached to becoming a slave. For example, Jacob volunteered for slavery, working for Laban without wage so that he could marry Laban's daughters. While Laban certainly proved to be a keener and craftier businessman than Jacob, he could not treat Jacob as a piece of property. Jacob, and other patriarchs like Joseph, suffered no dishonor for being slaves. In fact, slaves could hold positions of great importance in the ancient world. 4. This indentured servitude is more analogous to the life of peasantry in the feudal system than the lives of chattel slaves in the slave states. Lifelong servitude was strictly prohibited.
If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free, without paying anything.
An injured slave was to be set free with all debts cancelled.
An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth.
It was illegal to kidnap a person, to sell them into slavery.
Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession.
An escaped slave was to be given refuge by whoever they sought refuge with.
If a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand them over to their master. Let them live among you wherever they like, and in whatever town they choose. Do not oppress them.
5. Slaves could marry one another, but could not leave until both had paid their debts. Kidnapping and slave trading were forbidden, but foreign slaves could enter Israel as prisoners of war. If they were not ransomed, or if they could not save enough to purchase their own release, they could be slaves for life. However, they were within their rights to seek refuge with another if they were mistreated, and were to be released if beaten. 6. The New Testament epistles have no love of slavery. Paul wrote an impassioned plea to the church of the slave owner Philemon. He obliged Philemon to treat his slave, Onesimus, as a brother. Paul insisted that he should treat Onesimus just as he would treat Paul himself if he were to visit. As Paul was in chains at the time, and Philemon would want to free Paul, Philemon should free Onesimus. 7. While slaves should feel no shame, Paul does not see lifelong slavery as an ideal goal. Paul encourages slaves to gain their freedom. In Roman society 1/3 of the population were slaves, so Paul does not ask slaves to run away, or to fight for their freedom. Abolition was an unrealistic, unthinkable goal, and slavery did provide a means of social support for those who fell into debt and poverty. 8. 1 Timothy chapter 1 verse 10 groups slave traders with lawbreaker and rebels, the ungodly, the unholy and the irreligious. This reflects the Old Testament ban on kidnapping persons for the purposes of selling them. It is often unnoticed that if this command was followed consistently and universally, it would have undermined the practice and perpetuation of the slave trade in the Roman Empire. 9. What about the household codes which allow for slavery? Paul has no love of slavery, but he aims to moderate its practice rather than abolish it in one revolutionary sweep. It is clear that Paul will not tolerate slaves being treated as merely a piece of property or as a factor of production, to be used and abused at will. An inanimate tool or beast of burden with no sense of self other than that allowed by the slave owner and no legal, let alone civic, personality whatsoever. He expects slaves to take a full role in the church. 10. Slaves were part of family life, and Paul was addressing household slaves and those who own them. He encourages harmony, good working relationships and demands that slave owners be kind masters. Above all, we should not miss how radical Paul's household codes were. He directly addresses household slaves as moral agents in their own right. Masters are warned that they will be held to account by their master. Above all, both household codes are to be read in the light of the profound moral and theological statements that precede them. The equality of all believers in Christ, and the call for mutual submission in the Christian household, precluded believers from lording it over one another. The brutal treatment of slaves was not an option for Christians, and no Christian should believe in the inferiority of any other human being.